I worked out the other day that I've spent about 2/3 of my life at school, which I think is on balance a good thing. Not just as a student, but as a teacher as well. And most of that time as a primary school teacher. And I guess it must be that to a large extent, I like schools. I think they're great places. And I was thinking back to my primary school and what it is that really sticks in my mind from that time. One of the things, just check if this is going to work. Do you remember Binker, embroidering on Binker? This was the kind of first thing that came to my mind. And I remember learning to play the recorder, and I have a huge amount of memory of sitting in assemblies and watching my head teacher up on the stage. He had this sort of squeak, I remember, his shoes squeaked as he stood there in his suit, and he told us stories, and we sang hymns, and I remember sitting behind girls who had much thicker and longer hair than I did, and wishing that I'd got that hair and could fiddle with bobs in the way that they did. I remember pink custard, which I absolutely loved. And I remember warm milk, which I absolutely hated. And but couldn't get out of drinking. School was a good time for me, certainly in primary. My secondary school experience was a slightly different one. And my son was asking me recently, as part of his PSHE homework, about my career. He'd been asked to interrogate me and find out what had gone on. And, in particular, why I'd chosen to be a teacher in the first place. And, I kind of thought back, and I remember a strong sense that I knew I wanted to do something that I felt would make a difference. I wanted to make a positive contribution to society. But I also remember very clearly feeling that it would be a place where I could work creatively. And to a very large extent, that is what teaching was for me. But I was mindful as I was talking to him about whether I would still be able to say that it was the job that I entered more than 25 years ago. I want to show you a sign that I saw hanging up in a classroom not very long ago, which I think tells quite a lot about what is going on in schools and what has gone on in a lot of schools. I have to say, having walked around this school, a lot of what I'm saying absolutely doesn't apply to this school, but it does apply to a lot of schools in this country. This is the sign. I hope.
Are you doing that right-hand click?
I'm right-hand clicking.
Is it behind you?
Oh, that's what it is. I was told. Oh, sorry, there's the credit. So this is the sign that I saw. And it was indeed hanging in a very small alcove in the classroom. And, and of course what it says, which was true of schools, is that creativity, first of all, is something that you only get to do with things like paintbrushes, certainly, maybe within the arts at best. But even then, actually, from what I was seeing, it was only happening in limited ways, and it wasn't in ways that really gave people the opportunities to express their own original thought. And so anyway, I want to take a little sort of kind of broad look at what's happened in schools over the last 40 or so years, which, going back to when I started school. What's been happening? How have schools evolved during that time? And I suppose schools like the one I went to were considered reasonably progressive, I think, at the time, and would have been probably broadly influenced by a grassroots movement to make schools what was called more child-centred. It was an approach to teaching and learning that was influenced by great thinkers like Dewey and Holt and Freudel, and before them Vygotsky, and probably, followed the aspirations of people whose own education system, whose own education experience, whose own experience of school had been overly authoritarian, rather austere, rather lacking imagination, and they wanted something that was better suited to the needs of the children, where children would have opportunities to learn through their play, where teachers would have the possibility of designing teaching and learning opportunities that would really meet the needs of the kids they work with. Sounds like a great idea, and it was. As I say, the thinking behind it was very exciting and strong. But it got itself a name for lacking rigour. And from what I saw as a young teacher, when I entered the profession, I think to some extent that was with good reason. I think, where people did it well, it was inspirational. But actually, I came across teachers in my early years who genuinely and naively believed that if you offer children beautiful resources and lovely experiences, actually as a teacher you could kind of stand back, let them get on with it, and they would succeed. And that you didn't really need to do anything very proactive at all. And not surprisingly, as a result, children slipped through and in some cases failed to acquire some really basic skills. And so it was in the context of that government decided that there needed to be tighter regulation about what went on in schools. And it was at that point that we saw the introduction of the national curriculum with all its associated assessments and standardised testing. And that happened around the time I came into education, and certainly there was a feeling in schools, and I felt it too, that there was room for improvement, and that things could be tightened up, and that guidance on, particularly for a primary school teacher who has to be such a polymath, guidance on what it is to really think scientifically and what it is to think historically, could be very useful. But because of the way it was rolled out, what we very soon saw, because of the extent to which the curriculum became packed and very knowledge-based, what we saw very quickly was, rather than education that was child-centred, was a learning, an educational system where the curriculum was very much at the centre. And what we had was something that Victorians would have been relatively familiar with, which was a situation where knowledge was very much in pursuit of the child. I'm going to have to give you that quote, it won't come up on the PowerPoint. Where knowledge was very much in pursuit of the child as opposed to the other way around. Do you know who this is? It's a quiz now. It should have been there, but I'm going to... Well done, George Bernard Shaw, who said, what we want to see is the child in pursuit of the knowledge as opposed to the other way around. Actually, he didn't say that. I said it much better than that. I can't remember. I hadn't memorised that bit because I didn't think I needed to. So, yes, and we ended up with a curriculum that was heavily knowledge-based, and we saw a sort of obsession with coverage. There was no time to do things in any great depth. It was a race to get through it all. And we pre-packaged learning plans and schemes of work were, we flooded the market, and teachers lapped them up, understandably, because it was the one way of actually coping with the mass of work they had to get through that they were very clearly instructed to do. And so we ended up with something very mechanistic. The timetable was chopped up into little pieces, filled with chunks of learning that children were encouraged to swallow and digest. The learning did very little connection between one chunk of learning and another, and very much like the assembly lines of early 1900s, Henry Ford's car manufacturing assembly lines, children were pushed through the week and the months and the terms in the hope that, if they could be, if the necessary component parts could be attached to them, they would come out at the other end, hitting targets and passing exams. It was actually a brilliant example of how so much more became so much less. I don't know if you met these characters. We had the misfortune to meet Walton Wolf. They're a bit like sort of Scooby-Doo baddies. They sort of manifest in different ways in different schools. They're not always a dog and a couple of mad sort of discoing characters, but they often do. The dog does seem to appear quite often. And you see them in a lot of schools, in primary schools and in secondary schools. So they're up on walls, they're on whiteboards, they're at the top of worksheets. And the idea is that they clarify for the children what the objective of a given lesson is, which, in itself you might not think is such a bad idea until you look more closely and see the kinds of things that happen with these. I hope this text is going to work. Yes, it is. Here was an objective. This was an objective given to a group of children whose teacher had it on his schedule for the term that they needed to learn the skill of explanation writing, which is national curriculum language for do a bit of writing that explains how something works. These children had had the good fortune the week before to reconstruct and play with a Saxon, a reproduction Saxon loom, and he thought it would be a good idea to get them in their writing to explain how the loom worked. And these were the more detailed objectives he offered those children. Can you read that? Yes. So he did have on the worksheet, write about the Saxon loom, but beyond that, this was what he was asking these kids to do. And he told me that these kids were quite tricky, quite badly behaved, and I'm afraid I sat there and thought, I'm not surprised. These were 8-year-olds, any self-respecting 8-year-old would put their energies into having a bit of a mess around than attend to objectives such as those. And I think it would be safe to say that, there has been a growing awareness that this mechanistic system simply doesn't work that well for real people. And that there were children moving through this system who were, manifesting all sorts of symptoms of disengagement and, not surprisingly weren't achieving. And so we then saw, towards the end of the last decade, the personalised learning agenda, which was some kind of an attempt to address this, to make the system better fit for, real human use. But it was introduced in the same kind of mechanical way and attached to a system that was already, highly mechanistic and not at all, in my view, fit for purpose. And I think has made very little difference to how effective teaching and learning is in schools. But it is something else as well, which I think is almost a bigger concern for me, which is I think it reinforced a culture in schools, and possibly even more widely actually, around a sort of obsession with individuality, about the needs of the individual, the rights of the individual, the desires of the individual, and so on. Whilst nobody would argue that it is the job of schools to attend to every individual, and it's the job of schools to ensure that every child succeeds, I think what schools have failed to do, and I think the personalised learning agenda didn't help, what they failed to do is to give equal value and importance to the needs of the group, and what's possible when we come together and think collectively, and how we can make our communities better and cleverer places if we do that, our school communities, our local communities, and perhaps most important of all, our global communities. And I have this kind of image, of sort of thousands of years' time, people coming back to our ruined and deserted cities, like we visit ruined and deserted cities today, and being taken around these cities, and the tour guide saying to them, it is, evidence now, would suggest that these people, were so fixated on the needs of the individual and on individual success that despite knowing they were facing massive environmental disaster, they simply didn't get around to addressing the bigger picture. I have got some good news though, I don't want to make it too gloomy, which is that I was queuing up in the post office, my local post office recently. I'm going with comfort, isn't it? I was queuing up in our local post office recently, and I noticed that our local constabulary seems to have some kind of campaign going on, so I'll go back to him in a minute. Tiny bit worried about the spelling, but it feels like it's a step in the right direction. So I'm going to keep going, I'm not going to go back to that guy because I'm worried I'm going to run out of time. So, this is kind of where we're up to, really. The question is really sort of where next? Well, you may have heard on the news that there is talk of reform. In the last couple of weeks, there's been talk of further reform. There's always talk of reform in schools. And this time it's been inspired, prompted by the university tutors who have found that the undergraduate students they're receiving aren't sufficiently independent-minded. No surprise there. And that they would like to receive students who had a better sort of sense of themselves, their own voice and their own ideas. And so the government's considering asking the university advisors to give them guidance on, how they could rewrite, in this instance, the A-level syllabus. Actually, I know that this has been a problem for a long time, because I was one of those students who years ago, I can't remember how many years, a lot of years ago, was in my final year, took the research I'd done for my dissertation to my tutor, piles and piles of stuff I'd collected, ideas that other people had written about. And I took this stuff to my tutor and I said, here's my work so far. And he looked at me and he said, great, what a fantastic collection of work. I cannot wait to hear what your thesis is. I went slightly ashen. And then I think a few days later I went to my fine art tutor. I was doing a combined honours course and showed him the paintings I painted over the last summer break. And he said, they're great. So, they're nice, but they're very derivative. I'm interested to see what you, in the last few months that are left, are going to do as your own original artist. And for 16 years of my education, I had digested and regurgitated within, a predefined curriculum what other people thought. And there, the 11th hour of my education, I was being asked to say what I thought and who I was. And frankly, I simply didn't know where to begin. So, but there was a time when I was a fearless, adventurous and creative thinker. And it was a time, before I'd gone to school and perhaps in the early years of my education when I still played as soon as I got back from school. It happened in trees, it happened in the backs of cupboards, it happened in my bedroom, it happened behind the sofa, it happened on the tops of sheds, it happened anywhere and everywhere. And it was at home that I had my adventures, and it was at home where I made a mess and made mistakes and started again. And it was at home where I was fearless and forever inquiring and hopping from one question to the next. And so I would argue that actually it's the early years teachers, if anyone, who ought to be now feeding into the next phase of reform in this school, because in this country, because it's the early years teachers who know what our youngest children already bring with them, and it's they who know how to set up the environments and the experiences that will best hold on to those habits and nurture them, rather than allow them to become dormant. Pippa, I'm going to go on for another couple of minutes, is that all right? So this is where we are. We have the preschool child who has all intact that they need to learn and inquire. They come ready-made with that stuff and they just can't stop doing it. And then we have the PhD students who somehow got beyond their undergraduate stage, and they're again independent, and I don't know how they've done it, probably their tutors have just terrified them back into it. And then we have this space in between. We've had the child-centred model, which I think was ineffectual and rather woolly, and we had the mechanistic system, which was equally inadequate. So what do we put instead? You remember the teacher and his Saxon Loom kids and the learning targets? This is what I proposed to him instead, was that children could, instead of sitting down with a worksheet, could be invited to make a documentary about the loom, a simple documentary. For that documentary they would need a clear script, and that clear script would include causal links and clear sequencing and commas and paragraphs, because without it, it simply wouldn't make sense. And the documentary would be something that would take them time, it would be a challenge, and they would have to work hard at it. But they would be excited to do that because it would be worth it. It would be exciting and motivating. So that's the kind of thing that I believe should go in our place. And I'm really finishing now. What I believe we need in that middle place between the early child who has what they need and the PhD student is opportunities for learning that give children opportunities to do things for real in ways that will truly engage them, opportunities to keep their minds open and their curiosity intact, opportunities to raise their own questions and to explore ideas that really engage them, opportunities that help them to value collaboration and what that can bring about, time and space to make mistakes, time to get things wrong, time to learn from experience rather than from instruction, and the intrinsic reward, opportunities to give them the intrinsic reward of doing something for real. I believe if we can set up an education system that works on those principles, we will have something that is capable of truly nurturing the brilliance of our human potential.